The house was silent when I arrived. Not a sound, not even the faint ticking of the clock I had set years ago. But I knew something was off the moment I stepped inside. My mother's laugh usually echoed through these walls, but today nothing. I found the letter on the kitchen counter, her handwriting precise, deliberate. It wasn't addressed to me, yet it contained my name, my inheritance, my grandmother's trust. I froze. A memory flickered. A safe deposit box, my grandmother's insistence, her faith in me, but it had always been mine. Now it seemed someone else had decided otherwise, and I was suddenly the one who didn't belong. The mornings in our house were always quiet, not in a heavy or oppressive way, just a calm rhythm, predictable, comforting. I would wake before anyone else, linger at the edge of the kitchen doorway, watching my mother move through her morning routine. She made tea with meticulous care, arranging each cup, spoon, and plate in precise alignment. The clinking of china, the subtle hiss of water boiling, the faint aroma of bergamot, it all felt familiar, safe, like the world had been put in order before the day began. I had always trusted her. Perhaps too much. Trust in my family was not spoken aloud. It was expected. My mother believed in preparation, in control, in keeping things neat and exact. She had handled my grandmother's affairs for years before I was old enough to understand, and I had watched her quietly, absorbing what she considered normal. To me, it was flawless precision, the mark of someone who deserved confidence. My grandmother had always been a figure of quiet authority, and in her own way, she had trusted me. I remembered the day she had handed me the envelope containing the papers for the safe deposit box in my name. "This is yours," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "I am giving it to you now because I know you will honor it even if no one else does." I had clutched the papers to my chest, thrilled by her faith, and promised silently that I would never let her down. Those memories now felt like distant light in a room that was growing dim. At the time, everything was orderly. Our dinners were quiet but steady. My mother would check in with small questions about my day, offering approval for nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement that I existed and participated. I never questioned the arrangement, nor did I feel the need. Trust, like air, was invisible but essential. Even my interactions with extended family were filtered through her guidance. Invitations, responses, and small favors were all managed with her discretion. I never spoke up unless asked, and even then my words were carefully chosen. In a house where perception mattered more than emotion, observation had become my skill. I noticed patterns, the way her eyes lingered on certain bills, how she frowned at the ledger only after ensuring no one was watching. These were small things, but I filed them away mentally, cataloging them for a future I had not yet imagined. I kept my own routines, simple and silent. Mornings spent reviewing personal journals, afternoons with work or study, evenings with quiet reflection. I did not need attention or applause. The comfort of being unseen often felt like a shield. And yet, even in that invisibility, I had begun to understand the unspoken rules. Trust those who deserve it, but watch closely. Watch carefully. My mother's trust in me had always been implicit, too. She shared anecdotes, family stories, and occasionally, small tasks of responsibility. It was never for display. It was to test, to measure. I had learned that every gesture carried weight. Even the smallest decision, like where to place the sugar or how to file a receipt, could reveal character. Over the years, I had quietly accepted these tests, answering without complaint, never seeking recognition. And yet there was always a subtle tension, a thin line separating comfort from control. My mother's satisfaction was never loud or warm. It was measured, deliberate, almost scientific. Praise came rarely and without flourish. It was a calm acknowledgement, a nod to competence rather than affection. But I had never minded. I had grown accustomed to restraint, to the absence of drama, to the quiet world where consequences were unseen but understood. The foundation of trust, however, was always present. I knew where I stood, or I thought I did. I knew the boundaries of her authority, the limits of family expectation, and the rhythm of our lives. Every morning I brewed my tea alongside hers. Every evening I returned the cups to their exact positions. Small gestures, small certainties, but they grounded me. It was a world where order mattered more than emotion, where silence carried weight, and where observation was more powerful than speech. I had learned to navigate it with care, to anticipate consequences, to respect authority quietly. And in that balance, I had thrived, underestimated by all but secretly attentive, quietly capable, quietly faithful to a trust that I believed could never be broken. For now, that trust seemed unshakable. The world outside could wait. Within these walls, the rhythm remained, the tea was hot, the clocks ticked, and life continued in the quiet certainty of routine. But I could not have known that every careful observation, every gesture of faith, was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. The first unease came like a shadow stretching across a familiar room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it lingered long after I noticed it. One morning, as I opened the mail, I saw an envelope addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting. My heart caught, but then I hesitated. My mother was in the kitchen, humming quietly, and I paused, thinking she had probably already seen it. When I asked her about it, she shrugged, her tone airy, almost dismissive. Probably just a note from the bank, nothing to worry about. But it was not nothing. I could feel it in the way she avoided my gaze, how her hands trembled for a fraction of a second when she handed me a cup of tea. I told myself it was my imagination. Perhaps I had read too much into the small irregularities, the brief pause in her rhythm. I wanted to trust the rhythm, the order of the house, the way things had always been. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Other moments followed, quiet but persistent. A ledger moved slightly from where I had left it. A conversation about my grandmother's estate changed tone when I entered the room, and suddenly, words that seemed casual had a weight I couldn't ignore. A slip of phrase, a small hesitation. My mother's carefully constructed facade felt like it was cracking, revealing something she preferred I not see. Even in daily routines, I noticed shifts. Certain drawers were locked when they had never been before. Bills were reordered in ways that didn't make sense. I asked questions casually about small matters. Why is this document here? Or didn't this folder belong somewhere else? Each time her answer was calm but dismissive, a gentle brush off, a reminder that my curiosity was perhaps unnecessary, even foolish. At first, I blamed myself. Perhaps I had become overly attentive, overly cautious. Perhaps my imagination was exaggerating the inconsistencies. After all, life had always been orderly, predictable, and quiet. I had been raised in an environment where control was essential and deviation was rare. Maybe the world was fine, and I was simply noticing what did not exist. Yet the discomfort persisted. Even in her casual remarks, there was a subtle tension I could not ignore. A reference to the safe deposit box that felt off, a story about my grandmother that did not align with what I remembered, a fleeting glance that suggested knowledge withheld. I began to catalog these moments silently, recording them in my mind, without mention to anyone. Observation, I reminded myself, was my strength. Quiet attention could detect what others overlooked. I began paying attention to how others behaved around her. Friends and distant relatives often left hurriedly after brief visits, their smiles polite but fleeting. A question asked about my grandmother's possessions was always met with a carefully timed pause, a suggestion that some topics were better left untouched. Even the house staff moved differently in her presence, their movements cautious, almost reverential. I noticed these subtleties, filing them away, though I still could not name the reason for the unease. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the library, rifling through old photo albums and letters my grandmother had left. A photograph of her smiling at me, the envelope from the safe deposit box tucked behind the frame, seemed to glow in the muted sunlight. I could feel the weight of her trust pressing against me. And yet, in that same moment, the house felt heavier, charged with secrets. I realized that some truths were being hidden from me, and that those who should have protected them might not. Despite these small alarms, I continued my routine, tea in hand, notebooks open, silently observing. I refused to confront her, refused to disturb the fragile balance. The discomfort was present, yes, but not yet undeniable. I told myself patience was necessary, that restraint was essential. Yet deep down, I understood that the quiet moments of hesitation, the pauses, the inconsistencies, were no longer accidental. I was beginning to see the pattern, though only faintly. The shadows were stretching, but I was still learning their shape. The home that had always felt safe, that had always been predictable, now carried a subtle tension I could neither ignore nor yet name. Trust had cracks, and in those cracks, the first hints of betrayal were beginning to glimmer, small, almost imperceptible, like sunlight through a barely closed curtain. It started with small inconsistencies, barely noticeable if one wasn't paying attention. I had begun keeping mental notes, a silent record of each irregularity, each moment that felt off. One evening, while helping my mother sort through old papers for tax purposes, I noticed a document that did not match the careful order she usually maintained. It was a letter from the bank, dated months ago, addressed to me, but it had never been shown to me before. I asked about it casually, keeping my voice neutral. "I don't remember seeing this. Did Grandma give it to you?" She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the counter. The pause was deliberate, calculated. "I must have set it aside, nothing important." Her dismissal didn't feel genuine. It was too smooth, too rehearsed. My pulse quickened, but I forced calm. I had learned the value of observation over confrontation. Yet the seed of suspicion had grown roots, and now it was impossible to ignore. Other signs began to accumulate. Small discrepancies in her stories about Grandma's estate, fleeting contradictions about conversations I had shared with her, even tiny changes in how household accounts were recorded. The ledger, once pristine, now had notes and numbers that conflicted with my own records. Each inconsistency alone was minor, easily dismissed. Together, they formed a quiet pattern that tugged at the edge of my awareness. A conversation with an old family friend made the unease tangible. I had called casually, intending only to ask about a past family gathering, but their words were cautious, almost guarded. "I'm sure your mother explained everything about Grandma's will," they said, a hint of hesitation in their voice. I didn't press. The way they had said it, though, the pause, the inflection, felt like a warning. I filed it silently, alongside the other anomalies. Even interactions within the household began to feel strained. My mother's tone shifted when I mentioned the safe deposit box. A slight tightening around her eyes, a subtle drawl in her speech, and a faint sigh as if I had touched something too sensitive to discuss. I had memorized these small signals over the years, the flicker of expression that betrayed an unspoken truth. They were the whispers of intent, subtle yet revealing. One afternoon, while reorganizing the study, I noticed a folder tucked behind other files. Its contents were unfamiliar: old receipts, account statements, and correspondence that referenced the safe deposit box. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through them. Nothing was overtly alarming, but the implications were unmistakable. It seemed someone had been managing the contents without my knowledge. I confronted her indirectly, through questions that seemed casual but were loaded with intent. "I found these statements. Did Grandma ever talk to you about them?" Her response was measured. "I've always handled what needed handling. You wouldn't want to worry about it." The words were familiar, comforting in tone, but the underlying message was clear. I had been excluded deliberately. The pattern of omission, once subtle, had become impossible to ignore. I understood now that my trust had been misplaced, not through malice perhaps, but through choice. Even daily routines became a study in subtle control. My mother's careful placement of bills, her insistence on certain signatures, her occasional misdirection, all suggested a careful orchestration I had been blind to for years. Observation, once a passive skill, had become essential. Every gesture, every pause, every slightly misplaced object carried weight. That night, I sat alone in my room, reviewing mental notes, piecing together the fragments of evidence. Each irregularity was small, yet collectively they formed a map pointing toward exclusion, toward concealment. I realized I could no longer trust appearances. The quiet home that had always been a sanctuary was now a space of subtle deception. The first red flags had become unmistakable. The comfort of routine had cracked. The silence of the house now felt heavier, charged with tension. The envelope I had found, the discrepancies in ledgers, the guarded conversations with outsiders, all of it was pointing to a reality I was only beginning to understand. For the first time, I questioned the assumptions I had held my entire life. The belief in my mother's honesty, the trust in the order she maintained, the implicit faith I had carried since my grandmother's final days, all of it was unraveling, quietly, like threads pulled from a tapestry. I was beginning to see the shape of the truth, but I had not yet named it aloud. And in that recognition, I felt something else, a cautious, almost imperceptible resolve. Observation alone would not be enough. I would need patience, restraint, and clarity. Every subtle gesture, every quiet detail could become evidence. I was ready to watch more closely than ever before. The unease was no longer fleeting. It had grown roots. The first red flags had appeared, and I could not look away. It started subtly, like a mist creeping across familiar ground. I would raise a question, something that had been gnawing at me for weeks, only to be met with a smile so calm it felt rehearsed, a tone so casual it demanded I dismiss my own doubts. "You're imagining things," my mother said one evening as I held a ledger in my hands, the inconsistencies glaring. "Everything has always been handled. You worry too much." The words were soft, almost tender, but the weight behind them was heavy. I wanted to believe her, wanted to fold myself back into the comfort of routine, but my mind refused. Observation had become instinct, and instinct was telling me that the truth was being masked, carefully, deliberately. Moments like these multiplied. A casual remark about the safe deposit box, a flippant mention of Grandma's will. Phrases that should have been simple were twisted to make me feel foolish. "You always overthink," she said once, brushing a pile of papers from the kitchen counter. "Grandma would be disappointed if you doubted the people she trusted." I remembered my grandmother's faith, the envelope she had handed me, the safe deposit box she had entrusted to me. The contradiction between her trust and my mother's words made my chest tighten. I had never felt so small, so doubted, so quietly invalidated in my own home. Even my attempts at clarity were met with subtle dismissal. When I asked to see financial records or correspondence, she would smile and say, "You wouldn't understand. It's complicated." The tone suggested concern for my ability, but in reality, it was a shield, a way to obscure, to maintain control. I had become a witness to my own exclusion, and yet they framed it as my inability to comprehend. The gaslighting extended beyond words. Documents I had left on desks were moved or altered. Notes I had written disappeared, only to reappear later with slight changes that implied my memory was failing. Conversations I remembered clearly were recounted differently when she spoke, small omissions and tweaks designed to make me doubt my own mind. Every interaction carried a subtle psychological weight, pressing me into silence. Even family dinners became exercises in restraint. My questions, my attempts to gently probe, were met with laughter or a light-hearted correction that implied I was forgetful or too serious. "You always take things so seriously," she would say. But the laughter never reached her eyes. It was performance, practiced and precise, designed to reassure the house, and perhaps herself, that the narrative remained under control. The more I observed, the more I realized that my mother had mastered the art of quiet dominance. Power in our household was never shouted, never displayed through anger. It was woven into routine, into the control of information, into the subtle shifts of tone that could unsettle without ever being overt. And now, I was learning, painfully, that I was trapped within its quiet perimeter. I noticed the way she handled others, too. The house staff, distant relatives, even friends who called. They laughed at jokes that were not funny, deferred to comments that were barely spoken, and avoided topics that might reveal too much. Her influence was invisible, yet omnipresent. I was beginning to understand that this control extended far beyond me. It was systemic, embedded in the very fabric of how the household functioned. Some nights, lying awake, I replayed conversations, reconstructing the ledger, the letters, the casual remarks that carried hidden meanings. The isolation weighed heavily, but it also sharpened my focus. I had learned to endure silence and restraint, and now I understood their necessity. To act impulsively would expose me, make me vulnerable, perhaps even confirm the narrative she sought to impose. I had to remain calm, even as my awareness of betrayal grew. Yet beneath the dismissal, beneath the carefully constructed facade, I sensed cracks. A hesitation in her voice, a faint glance at the misplaced documents before she corrected them, a fraction of a second too long where control wavered. These were fleeting, nearly invisible, but they told me that even the orchestrator of exclusion could falter. Observation was still my ally, and patience remained my strategy. The emotional cost was undeniable. Each day, each interaction chipped away at my trust, my confidence, my sense of belonging. I felt the weight of being dismissed, of having my perception questioned, of seeing a mother who once inspired faith now wrapped in subtle deception. And yet, even in that quiet erosion, I held on to one certainty. I had to see the truth fully before any action could be taken. By the end of those weeks, the pattern had become undeniable. Gaslighting was no longer subtle. The dismissal, the manipulation, the carefully timed words, all pointed toward the same conclusion. I was being excluded, minimized, and controlled. And though I remained outwardly composed, the understanding of what was happening burned steadily within me. I could feel the first stirrings of resolve forming beneath the weight of betrayal. Observation alone was no longer enough. I would need evidence, patience, and a keen awareness of the system she had built around me. Quietly, I began to prepare. Each ledger entry, each word spoken, each movement in the house became part of a larger record in my mind. The stakes were rising, and the first true threads of confrontation were taking shape, even if I could not act yet. The home that had always felt safe now carried a tension so quiet it could be mistaken for nothing at all. But I knew. I had seen the cracks. I had felt the manipulation. And I was learning, painfully, how to endure the weight of betrayal without breaking, at least outwardly. The first undeniable hint of truth arrived quietly, without fanfare, in the form of a misplaced envelope. I found it tucked behind the books on the living room shelf, a small, plain envelope addressed to me, but it had been opened. My pulse quickened, though I kept my voice calm when I mentioned it later. "I think this belongs to me," I said, careful not to sound accusatory. My mother's reaction was brief, controlled, almost dismissive. "I must have handled it temporarily," she said, with a tone that suggested nothing more needed to be said. But it was never just about envelopes. I began noticing small details I had overlooked before. A ledger I had once checked now had entries rewritten in a way that altered balances. Letters that referenced the safe deposit box mysteriously vanished from their usual drawer, and casual mentions by acquaintances that hinted at conversations I had never been part of. These weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle forming slowly, deliberately, and I was learning to recognize the pattern. One afternoon, I went through old correspondence, the kind my grandmother had kept meticulously. I knew the letters were meant for me, reminders of her trust, notes on her intentions. As I shuffled through them, I discovered that some had been removed entirely. Others bore annotations in my mother's handwriting, small, almost imperceptible notes that shifted the tone and context of my grandmother's words. It was subtle, but enough to confirm my suspicion. My inheritance, my safe deposit box, the trust my grandmother had placed in me, was being quietly redirected. Even more revealing were the witnesses, those who had no reason to lie or protect anyone. The family friend I had once called casually began speaking differently when I asked about my grandmother's affairs. "I think you should ask your mother directly," they said, their voice careful, almost hesitant. The hesitation alone spoke volumes. Another acquaintance mentioned, in passing, that they had been told information regarding the safe deposit box, but never given access to me. Small, scattered confirmations began to accumulate like drops of water forming a stream, undeniable when viewed together. It was in the quiet hours that the implications sank in. Sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, I began to piece together the timeline. Letters opened and redirected, account balances adjusted, casual deflections from people who had knowledge but were wary of speaking. Each fragment alone might have seemed insignificant, but together they told a coherent story. My mother had been slowly asserting control over the assets my grandmother had entrusted to me, systematically managing them without my awareness. The realization carried weight beyond financial matters. It was an erosion of trust, a quiet usurpation of the faith my grandmother had placed in me. I felt the first real sting of betrayal, not in anger, not in confrontation, but as a quiet, internal acknowledgement that someone I had loved and trusted had chosen secrecy over transparency, control over honesty. It was suffocating in its subtlety, as if the walls themselves conspired to reinforce the reality I had not wanted to see. Even daily interactions began to reflect the shift. My mother's tone carried a faint defensiveness, her movements calculated to obscure intentions. Bills that had once been routine now bore subtle adjustments. Accounts were closed without explanation. and casual references to my grandmother's instructions were altered or misrepresented. The house felt smaller, tighter, each room carrying the weight of unspoken truths. Observation, which had once been a quiet tool, became essential for survival within this space. I found myself cross-referencing every document, every letter, every casual remark with my mental record of what had been true. Patterns emerged, small yet undeniable. The ledger, once a simple tool for household finances, became a map of redirection, a record of access and exclusion. Envelopes, letters, and casual conversations all converged to reveal the first layer of the betrayal. My mother had not yet confronted me, not yet justified herself, but the evidence was accumulating silently, inexorably. At night, lying awake in my room, I reflected on the cost of this revelation. It was not only the potential loss of financial security, but the quiet undermining of trust, the manipulation of perception, and the subtle reshaping of history in a way that left me questioning what had been real. Yet I remained outwardly composed, careful not to reveal the intensity of my understanding. The skill I had cultivated over years of quiet observation, patience, restraint, and attention to detail, was now my shield. Partial exposure had changed the stakes. The small inconsistencies, once easily dismissed, had coalesced into a narrative I could no longer ignore. I could see the outlines of intention, the careful orchestration of omission, and the subtle manipulation of perception. My mother had not yet revealed her full plan, but the first layer of truth was now unmistakable, undeniable in its quiet accumulation of evidence. The psychological toll was immediate, though I concealed it. Each day carried a tension that was almost imperceptible to others but palpable to me. I watched, I recorded, I waited. Restraint became more than a habit. It was a strategy, a necessity for understanding the scope of what had been taken from me and for preparing for the confrontation I knew would eventually be unavoidable. The quiet exposure had begun. I now understood the breadth of her deception, if not yet its full depth. And in that understanding, a cold clarity took root. Patience, observation, and meticulous attention would be the only ways to navigate the betrayal that had begun quietly, but was growing steadily into something undeniable. The tension that had been simmering for weeks began to thicken into a pressure I could feel pressing against my chest. The partial exposure of my mother's manipulations had shifted the house into a new rhythm, one where every movement, every glance, and every word carried weight. It was no longer subtle, the stakes had risen, and the boundaries I had once taken for granted no longer existed. It started with small confrontations, indirect yet deliberate. I asked questions about documents, ledgers, and correspondence, framing them casually, as if I sought clarification. "I noticed a few statements were adjusted recently," I said one evening, trying to sound neutral. My mother's response was immediate, sharp in a way I had never heard before. "Those records are my responsibility. You wouldn't understand the complexity involved." The words were calm, almost polite, but the tone carried an unmistakable edge, a quiet warning. I began to notice other shifts in her behavior. She monitored my movements more closely, asking subtle questions about my daily routines, the hours I spent reviewing letters and records, and the conversations I had with distant relatives. Each question, casual on the surface, was a probe, an effort to gauge how much I knew and how much I had pieced together. The house that had once been predictable now felt like a minefield, each interaction fraught with invisible consequences. The escalation was not only psychological but systemic. Ledger entries were altered more frequently, Correspondence was rerouted, and accounts that had once been accessible to me became restricted. Even casual conversations with friends or acquaintances were filtered through her influence. Their hesitation, their carefully chosen words, now carried the unmistakable weight of caution. Every move I made was being observed, analyzed, and subtly redirected. I felt the first real sting of fear, not for my safety, but for the control of what had been entrusted to me. The safe deposit box, the inheritance, the tangible proof of my grandmother's faith, all were now contested in a quiet, almost invisible battle I had been unwillingly drawn into. And yet, outwardly, I remained calm. The restraint I had cultivated over years of careful observation became essential, the only way to navigate a space that had shifted from familiar to hostile without overt confrontation. There were moments that tested me deeply. One evening, I found a stack of letters I had carefully organized missing from the study. I asked casually, "Did you move these?" My mother's lips tightened briefly, and she looked away before answering. "I thought they might be in better order elsewhere. Don't worry about it." The words were simple, but the implication was clear. My authority, my claim, my right to even see the truth, was being denied. The subtle manipulation extended to others in the household. Staff who had once been neutral now mirrored her vigilance. Conversations with relatives became exercises in careful phrasing. Everyone, it seemed, had been woven into a network of quiet compliance that kept me on the perimeter. The realization was chilling. The betrayal was not only personal but systemic. I was not just being excluded, I was being contained. Despite this, I maintained outward composure. Each day, I recorded observations in my mind. Shifts in tone, alterations in documents, casual remarks that betrayed knowledge withheld. The house became a space of strategic observation rather than comfort. Every detail mattered. The position of a ledger, the placement of an envelope, the pause in her smile when I approached a certain topic. Each small observation was a thread in a web I was now carefully unraveling. One afternoon, while reviewing bank statements in private, I noticed several unusual transfers. Subtle, not large enough to raise alarms immediately, but enough to confirm a pattern of quiet redirection. My mother had begun reallocating assets without disclosure. I did not confront her then. Confrontation would play into her control, and I was determined to avoid giving her the upper hand. Instead, I documented meticulously, committing every detail to memory, preparing for the moment when evidence and observation could no longer be ignored. The escalation extended beyond documentation. Casual interactions became fraught with implication. A letter misplaced intentionally, a ledger entry revised subtly, a question about the safe deposit box deflected with a practiced smile. All were signs of a calculated effort to assert dominance and limit my access to what was rightfully mine. The psychological cost was immense, though I refused to show it. Each interaction left me quietly exhausted, aware of the manipulation but determined to endure. By the end of the week, the shift was undeniable. My mother's influence, once implicit and passive, had become active, direct, and intentional. The space I had once trusted was now dominated by a quiet control I could neither ignore nor openly challenge. Yet within this heightened tension, I felt the first stirrings of resolve, an understanding that restraint, careful observation, and patience were my only tools. I would not be overtaken by emotion, and I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. In this new reality, the home had changed its rhythm. Silence no longer signaled comfort, it carried tension. Each glance, each word, each gesture was imbued with stakes I had only just begun to comprehend. The escalation was complete. My mother had revealed without confrontation the extent of her control, and I had recognized without panic the depth of the betrayal. I knew then that the next phase would be critical. Patience alone would not suffice forever. The evidence, the witnesses, and the system itself had begun to whisper the truth, and I quietly had begun to prepare for the reckoning that would inevitably follow. By the time the truth had fully begun to settle in, I felt a weight pressing against my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with documents or ledgers and everything to do with betrayal. The pattern was no longer subtle. The letters, the safe deposit box, the careful redirection of assets, all were undeniable now. I understood that my mother had been systematically excluding me, quietly asserting control over what my grandmother had placed in my trust. And with that understanding came a moral clarity that was as painful as it was necessary. I had spent weeks watching, cataloging, and observing. I had maintained composure through subtle manipulations, careful deflections, and deliberate omissions. But the breaking point was not in witnessing her actions. It was in recognizing my own response, the quiet erosion of trust I had held my entire life. The realization that I could not recover what had been quietly taken from me without careful planning, and perhaps even without confrontation, was almost physical in its intensity. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to demand explanation, to confront the betrayal head-on. I imagined standing in the kitchen, my hands trembling, my voice steady but sharp, and laying out everything I had discovered. But restraint had been my ally for years, and I knew that to act without patience now would only give her control over the narrative. The cost of emotional reaction would outweigh any temporary satisfaction, so I chose silence. I spent hours in the library, the house quiet except for the faint ticking of clocks. I reviewed mental notes, reconstructed conversations, cross-referenced letters and ledgers. Every alteration, every omission, every redirection was cataloged in precise detail. The realization that I had been excluded so thoroughly, so deliberately, left me with a quiet fury I did not allow myself to express outwardly. Instead, I felt a slow, deliberate acceptance. The betrayal was real, but my response would not be impulsive. It would be calculated, observed, and contained. Even simple interactions became exercises in restraint. When my mother casually remarked about the safe deposit box, her tone light and rehearsed, I remained calm. I listened, observed, and recorded in my mind every detail of the conversation. Her confidence, her controlled demeanor, was matched only by the quiet strength I had cultivated. I had learned to endure emotional pressure without breaking, to recognize manipulation without reacting. And now, in the face of this betrayal, I relied on that skill more than ever. The psychological cost was heavy. I felt a constant tension in the chest, a quiet ache of disappointment and disillusionment. The home, once a sanctuary of routine and trust, had become a place of vigilance. Every gesture, every word, every pause carried potential deception. I walked through the rooms with a heightened awareness, noting the subtleties in her expression, the placement of papers, the carefully timed changes in tone. Observation was no longer just a skill. It was a necessity for understanding the full scope of what had been done. And yet, amid the clarity, there was also moral restraint. I realized that exposing the betrayal too soon or confronting it with anger could unravel more than I was ready to bear. The home itself, the delicate network of people who had been subtly influenced, and even the potential for future reconciliation or restitution, all demanded patience. I had to endure, to hold the truth quietly within me, to let it exist without allowing it to dictate my immediate actions. There were nights when I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where letters and ledgers had once been, imagining conversations that would never happen. I felt the quiet cost of understanding, the psychological toll of knowing betrayal and being powerless to correct it immediately. But I also felt a strange sense of empowerment, a clarity that came from seeing the system for what it was, from recognizing the deliberate choices that had been made, and from understanding that restraint could be the most potent response. I began to see the situation in terms of consequences rather than confrontation. The betrayal, once discovered, could not be ignored, but it did not require immediate action. Each subtle manipulation my mother had enacted would eventually reveal itself through patterns, through the very systems she had sought to control. I had become a quiet observer of consequences, and in that observation, I found a measure of control that no confrontation could offer. By the end of those days, I felt the moral and emotional breaking point settle into me, not as despair, but as acceptance. I understood fully what had been taken from me, how trust had been manipulated, and what the psychological cost had been. And I also understood that my response would not be driven by anger or vengeance. I would act when necessary, but with patience, precision, and quiet awareness. The breaking point was not a shout, not a confrontation. It was a heavy, calm acknowledgement of reality. I recognized the betrayal, felt its emotional cost, and chose restraint over reaction. In that moment, I understood the depth of manipulation, the subtle control, and the psychological toll. But I also understood my own strength, the quiet authority that came from observation, patience, and careful attention to detail. The emotional landscape of the house had changed forever, but within it, I had found a quiet clarity. The betrayal was real, the cost was heavy, and the path forward was not yet clear. But I was ready to endure, to observe, and to let the systems themselves reveal the truth in their own time. The truth, once partially revealed, now began to assert itself with quiet inevitability. The subtle manipulations, the omissions, and the carefully crafted deceptions that had kept me on the margins were no longer invisible. Patterns I had cataloged, letters I had cross-referenced, and the ledger I had studied so meticulously all converged to form an undeniable picture. My mother's control over what my grandmother had entrusted to me had been absolute, but even control has its limits, and those limits were beginning to show. It started with small admissions, unintentional slips in conversation that contradicted her previous assertions. A word here, a hesitation there, a ledger entry that couldn't be reconciled. Each acted like a chisel, slowly carving away the facade she had built. She spoke as if everything were normal, but the inconsistencies were now obvious, even to casual observers. People who had once mirrored her calm deference began to falter, their discomfort visible in fleeting expressions and careful word choices. The ledger, once pristine and seemingly unquestionable, became a focal point. When I reviewed it again, the changes and redirections she had orchestrated were unmistakable. Transactions that had been rerouted, letters opened and redirected, accounts closed without explanation, all pointed to the same truth. She had been manipulating the flow of what was mine. I did not need to confront her to understand the reality. The evidence spoke for itself. Witnesses began to surface, albeit quietly. Friends and relatives who had been cautious in previous conversations now hinted at their knowledge without needing to be prompted. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, one family acquaintance admitted. Another remarked, almost in passing, I thought it was best to stay out of it, but it seems things have shifted. Each remark, casual on the surface, confirmed what I had long suspected. The deception was not hidden to everyone, only to me. Even within the house, the tension shifted. The control my mother had exerted over staff and family became less absolute. Subtle errors appeared, gestures of hesitation, moments when instructions were not followed perfectly. The systems she had relied upon to maintain dominance began to show cracks. I noticed them carefully, cataloged them in my mind, understanding that every small slip was part of the quiet unraveling of her influence. The consequences were not dramatic, not explosive, but they were palpable. The ledger no longer aligned with her narrative. Letters surfaced that contradicted her statements. Bank records that she had hoped would remain hidden were now accessible through careful observation and cross-referencing. The quiet tension she had maintained for months was giving way to the inevitable weight of truth. Emotionally, the realization was complex. There was no satisfaction, no rush of vindication, only the sober understanding that what had been hidden could not remain concealed indefinitely. The betrayal, once orchestrated with precision, now faced the impartial scrutiny of systems, witnesses, and evidence. Her careful orchestration could not prevent the gradual emergence of reality, and I watched quietly as the house itself seemed to respond to the shift, the rhythm of control beginning to falter. I remained composed outwardly, observing every interaction, every slip, every slight pause. The cost of reaction had been evident to me long ago. Acting impulsively would only play into her hands. Instead, I allowed the evidence and the systems themselves to reveal the truth, understanding that time and patience were my most reliable tools. Each small confirmation, each inadvertent admission, strengthened my awareness without giving her cause for defensive action. By the end of the week, it was undeniable. The ledger entries, letters, and witness accounts formed a coherent, unassailable narrative. My mother's control, once absolute, had been quietly undermined by the very structures she had relied upon to maintain it. There were no confrontations, no dramatic outbursts, only the sober weight of reality settling into place. The consequences were clear. Deception could no longer hide behind the quiet authority she had wielded. And yet, even in the face of this clarity, I maintained restraint. There was no need for vindictive confrontation, no need for explosive revelation. The systems, witnesses, and records had done their work. Truth, slow and methodical, had exposed the betrayal. I allowed the quiet acknowledgement of consequence to exist without commentary, without celebration. My mother's actions had been revealed not through my intervention, but through the careful observation and patient collection of evidence. The house felt heavier now, but in a different way. The oppressive tension of control had eased slightly, replaced by the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. I walked through the rooms with measured steps, noting the subtle reactions of those around me. The betrayal had cost us all, but the recognition of reality was inescapable. The consequences, though understated, were complete. In that quiet, heavy awareness, I understood the power of patience, observation, and systems. The truth had emerged, not through confrontation or speech, but through its own weight, and in that emergence I felt a solemn clarity. The quiet consequences were now visible, and the betrayal, once hidden, could no longer shape my understanding of the past or the present.